Thank you for coming out tonight. I appreciate it, and I look forward especially to a question and answer session. I aim to talk for about 20 minutes and then get into the Q&A, which I think is always the more eventful and entertaining part of the evening. I want to begin by asking a question here tonight. Do we have any veterans here tonight of the Chosin Reservoir Campaign? Chosin Reservoir Campaign, anybody?
Right over here.
We have one right here. Colonel John Stevens?
Yes.
Wow. It is an honor, sir, to speak here tonight to you. I am in awe of the Chosin Reservoir Campaign. I want to talk specifically tonight about General Opie Smith. To my surprise, a surprising number of people don't know that he commanded at Chosin. A lot of people, even Marines, think that Chesty Puller somehow was in command there. And Opie Smith strikes me as a great example of American generalship. I would call my talk tonight, How Opie Smith Saved 10,000 Marines. It's a shame that he's not much talked about these days. He provides a fascinating case, not only of good generalship, but specifically of what to do when the commanders over you are wrong. Badly wrong. He's also relevant to us here tonight because he was very much of the Bay Area. He attended UC Berkeley, and he graduated in 1916 and then joined the Marine Corps. He died not far from here, where he'd retired to Los Altos. In Korea, Opie Smith had the misfortune to report to a Corps commander named Ned Almond, who in turn reported to General Douglas MacArthur. Ned Almond worshiped Douglas MacArthur almost as much as Douglas MacArthur worshiped Douglas MacArthur. And MacArthur was badly wrong in the fall of 1950 about what was going on in the Korean War. MacArthur believed the Chinese military would not intervene in the war. In fact, in a meeting on Wake Island in October 1950, MacArthur had assured President Truman that a Chinese invasion of Korea would not happen. And, he added, anyway, if it did, the Chinese would be wiped out by American aircraft. As we know, that's not quite what happened. Now, Opie Smith was not a MacArthur man. He was a Marine. Interestingly, Smith, in many ways, was more of a George Marshall man than the Army commanders, the Army generals to whom he reported. MacArthur and Marshall did not like each other. At one point in a conversation in World War II, MacArthur was talking to Marshall, and he referred to his staff. And George Marshall shook his head and said, "Douglas, you don't have a staff, you have a court." Opie Smith, by contrast, resembled Marshall. Both were quiet, reserved men. And in fact, Opie Smith had studied under Marshall at Fort Benning's infantry school. Smith was a pipe-smoking Christian Scientist. When he was 7 years old, his father died, and his mother took him from Texas to California. He arrived at Berkeley with $5 in his pocket. He worked his way through Berkeley, usually as a gardener. Keep that in mind the next time you walk past a gardener. It may be a future Marine general. In the 30s, unusually for a Marine officer, he attended the Army's infantry school at Fort Benning, which was then led by Lieutenant Colonel George Marshall. Smith's instructor in the use of machine guns was an officer named Omar Bradley. He was instructed in tactics by Joseph Stilwell. On the eve of the landing on Peleliu in World War II, Smith passed the time by reading a biography of Oliver Wendell Holmes. I think that shows an extraordinary calmness in a guy. The night before an amphibious landing you know is going to be rough. You sit down and read about Oliver Wendell Holmes. Peleliu isn't mentioned much nowadays in the American public. I think we in this room remember it, know it. The highest casualty rate of any American landing ever, according to Chester Nimitz, 40%. In Korea, in the fall of 1950, Opie Smith was commander of the 1st Marine Division. He was ordered to attack and go all the way to the Chinese border. There's a saying you might have heard that the essence of generalship is what you do before the battle begins. That's certainly the case with General Smith at Chosin. He made 3 important decisions at the very beginning. Interestingly, all 3 grew out of his deep distrust of General Almond and General MacArthur. The 3 decisions. First, he insisted on consolidating his forces so they could support each other. And this meant moving the 5th Marines from the east side of the reservoir over to the west side, and turning the eastern side of the reservoir over to the Army. Second, he made it a top priority to have his engineers scrape out 2 airstrips in the frozen ground. This was an incredibly important move. It meant that when things got rough and they were isolated and surrounded, he could fly in supplies and reinforcements and fly out as wounded. Not having the wounded encumbering him meant that he could conduct a far more effective retreat because the wounded slow you down. Ultimately, 4,300 wounded were flown out in just the 5 days that the airstrip was operational. It opened the afternoon of December 1, 1950, with the engineers at the end of the airstrip occasionally under fire and firing back as they worked. And it closed the evening of December 6, when the Marines retreated out of the base. Third, Smith physically located himself at what he believed, correctly, would be the key point in the battle. American forces at Chosin resemble kind of a giant Y. You have the Marines on the west side of the reservoir, the Army on the east side, and they come together at the junction of the Y at a place called Hagaru. Hagaru, Smith said, the junction point of the Y, right there in the middle, had to be held at all cost. So in the morning of November 28th, 1950, Smith left his rear headquarters and he flew to that junction. General Almond came to see him. "We've got to go barreling up that road," Almond said in his headquarters. Smith bit his tongue. When General Almond left, he turned to his staff and he said, "We're not going anywhere until I get this division together and the airfield built." Smith also wrote a personal letter to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, putting his case on the record. And I quote from it here: "Our left flank is wide open. I have little confidence in the tactical judgment of 10 Corps or in the realism of their planning. There is a continual splitting up of units, an assignment of missions which puts them out on a limb. It was a very long and lonely limb. To the west of the Marines, there was a gap in the line of 80 miles. To the east of the Marines, there was a gap in the line of 120 miles. Smith so distrusted General Almond's understanding of combat that he expected that U.S. forces would eventually be compelled to retreat. So he established along his road back to the sea 3 fortified base camps, about 1 day's march apart, loaded with supplies and well protected by infantry units led by Chesty Puller. Even as Almond was telling the Marines to charge north to the Yalu River, the Chinese border, the Marines were beginning to sense, in that ineffable way, changes in the atmosphere around them. Something was going on, and it was ominous. Normally, Korean children would pester them, begging for candy. Disappeared. Deer started moving down off the ridges. They were displaced by something. Smith was told, "Hey, Army intelligence has great news. There's a bridge to the north of us the Chinese forgot to blow." Smith shook his head. It's a trap, he thought, and he was right. The Chinese planned to lure the Marines northward, surround them, and finish them off. We now know from Chinese documents released over the last 20 years that that was exactly the Chinese plan. On November 13th, 1950, Marshal Peng, the Chinese commander in Korea, had called together his subordinates for a campaign planning meeting. And I quote from that meeting, quote, "We will employ a strategy of luring the enemy forces into our internal line and wiping them out one by one." Job one explicitly was wiping out the Marine force. They were told, encircle and exterminate the U.S. Marines around the reservoir. The plan here was to give Uncle Sam a bloody nose. Remember, the Chinese communists had only taken over a year earlier. They were not yet really seen as legitimate on the world stage. And there was a real strategic calculation here. Look, the Americans just won World War II. If we can come along 5 years later and really mess them up, it'll help establish us on the world stage as the true owners of China, which was then very much in contention still. So the battle began. On the night of November 27th, the two Marine regiments isolated at the northwestern end of the reservoir were attacked by two Chinese divisions. A third division, third Chinese division, came into the south of the two Marine regiments to try to cut them off. There was a hardness in these Marines, I think a justified hardness, but it was hard. Fox Company, 7th Marines, had been left atop a hill in a key pass to try to keep the road open back down to the Junction. Fox Company was resupplied by air for 5 days while surrounded and fighting off attacks. It built barricades around its position using frozen Chinese corpses. They killed the enemy wounded, reported a member of Fox Company, Ernest Gonzalez. It was so cold that when Marines were shot, their wounds did not turn brown or red, dark red, as wounds normally would. They froze pink because they froze before they could coagulate. Not quite at this point in the battle, but a classic Marine story. One Marine is limping along later in the battle, and a corpsman says, "Hey, you're limping. Come over here. Let me see your foot." And he says, "No, don't worry about it." He says, "No, sit down, Marine. Take off the boot. Let's look." And the corpsman looks at his foot and looks up and says, "You asshole, you're shot." He didn't even know he had a bullet in his foot. It's that cold. Over 5 days, Fox Company, 220 Marines, killed 450 Chinese soldiers. They lost 29 Marines. But Fox kept open, when Ray Davis comes in with his battalion, enough of the pass so that the retreat could begin down to the Junction. The two regiments, 5th and 7th Marines, fought for 4 days and 3 nights to fight their 14 miles down to Hagaru. They fought their way through 7 Chinese roadblocks. They moved slowly and carefully. They brought with them all their 1,500 casualties, 600 of them stretcher cases, and they brought with them all their dead. They had so many dead that the trucks overflowed, and they tied their dead across the hoods of the trucks, and then they tied their dead to the barrels of their artillery pieces. They marched into Hagaru half dead and singing the Marine Corps hymn. It was not inevitable that they would make it that far. At the same time that the Marines are retreating down the west side of the reservoir, the Army, a reinforced regiment from the 7th Army Division, is on the east side. And this, to me, is an amazing part of this battle that nobody remembers. Now, the Army regiment had the unfortunate position of having to obey Almond much more than Smith did. When this Army unit was attacked, Almond flew in by helicopter and told its commander, and I'm quoting, "Don't let a bunch of Chinese laundrymen stop you." This Army regiment eventually did try to retreat down the east side of the reservoir. It was wiped out. There were 3,300 men. They suffered a 90% casualty rate. The survivors survived by walking across the ice, stumbling across the ice, down to the junction point where Opie Smith was actually fewer soldiers, fewer Marines than the Army had in the regiment that was wiped out. A lot of those Army soldiers were saved by a Marine lieutenant colonel, a transport officer, who drove out with some corpsmen on the ice in trucks with sleds behind them for several days and policed up the bodies and the wounded that they could find. Interestingly, Chinese soldiers did not fire at them. Often they were just 50 feet from Chinese soldiers who just watched them go by. Eventually, this Marine officer got to the remains of the regiment where the convoy had finally stopped and been just utterly destroyed. And he looked into the trucks, but Chinese soldiers had thrown grenades into the trucks that held the wounded and so on, and they were all dead. So at this point, you have the Marines regiments have moved down the west side of the reservoir. The survivors of the Army regiment have come down into that point as well. On December 6th, Smith began the march back to the sea from the junction point southward. This retreat, people talk about how, Smith said, retreat hell, I'm just attacking another direction. There actually is a tactical point to this, it was not a classic retreat in which you are moving away from the enemy. He was moving through the enemy. He had these 12 Chinese divisions that were assigned to wipe him out, wipe out his one reinforced division. He planned the move even more carefully than an attack, with Marines moving along the flanking ridge lines to protect the column. He had about 1,000 trucks, tanks, and other vehicles in his column, but he gave the order, anybody who could walk would. Don't ride. This was for two purposes. First, to keep Marines warmer by making them keep moving, and second, to better protect the flanks. Smith said he felt very confident in this force. They could pretty much go where they wanted, though being surrounded by a vastly larger force. He wrote later, after the battle, this was a very powerful force. It was well supplied with ammunition, fuel, and rations, and was powerfully supported by Marine and carrier-based air, possessed organically artillery, tanks, and the whole gamut of infantry weapons, and had dedicated officers and men to carry the fight to the enemy. It was a powerful force, but to fight southward 11 miles, they had to go through 9 more roadblocks. It took 39 hours and 600 more casualties. They got to Koto-ri, where General Almond again appeared. He had flown over the convoy and was outraged to see parts of it were stopped because Marines would not bypass ambushes. They would stop and fight back and remove the threat. Almond was angry, he said. You need to keep that convoy moving faster, he lectured him. I just admire Opie Smith at this point for not reaching out and strangling Almond. The Marines made it out on this leg of the fight and coming down to the plains. They hit a whiteout snowstorm. One Marine wrote that during the snowstorm, they had a firefight. There were weird streaks of orange that flew at us out of a blinding snow clouds. So the Marines got to the sea. They got on the Navy ships. I think had Opie Smith not made hard decisions and likely risked his career, that the Marine force might have been wiped out. Indeed, Omar Bradley, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs, told a Marine officer on the Joint Staff that he was assuming that the 1st Marine Division was gone. It would have been easier for Smith to follow his orders. In fact, General Shepard, his superior in the Marine Corps, had told him, he said, "Opie, go along with Almond, listen to him." Smith refused, and he did this very difficult thing for a commander. He did what he thought was the right thing rather than explicitly follow his orders. If he had followed his orders, it would have been the greatest military disaster in our history. There would have been perhaps 10,000 Marines lost, perhaps more. That's Little Bighorn times 50. Think of the implications of that. If the 1st Marine Division had been wiped out, it would have been a great military victory for communism, and the course of the Korean War would have been far different. I see 2 possible alternatives. The first was that, as the Joint Chiefs were recommending and MacArthur was talking, that U.S. forces would have been withdrawn from the Korean Peninsula, and Korea today would be entirely communist. And I think North Korea is probably the worst place in the world to live. The entire peninsula would be like that. I think the United States, had it withdrawn from Korea, might well have retreated into continental isolationism. The other prospect is they would have followed Douglas MacArthur's other wish list and used what he said, perhaps 36 nuclear weapons to attack China. He wanted to embargo Chinese ports, bomb Chinese airfields, and he thought it would be a neat idea to move Chinese nationalist forces to Korea. Neither of these prospects is appealing, isolationism or nuclear warfare against China. The Chinese, by the way, suffered huge losses at Chosin. Out of the 12 divisions that attacked Smith's division, they suffered 25,000 killed, 12,000 wounded, and tens of thousands of additional casualties from frostbite. The 12 divisions were withdrawn from the front until March of the following year. It was a tactical defeat for the Chinese, but it was a strategic victory. The Communist Chinese, this new government that had just taken over in Beijing, had taken on the world's most powerful country and forced it to retreat. Nonetheless, what I take away from Chosin is profound admiration for the generalship of Opie Smith. One Army historian called Smith's performance at Chosin perhaps, and I'm quoting, perhaps the most brilliant divisional feat of arms in the national history. I agree with that assessment. Smith's career after that point was unremarkable. He retired from the Marines in 1955. He lived quietly near here in Los Altos, and he gardened every day in the combat boots he had worn at Chosin. He died on Christmas Day, 1977. Thank you very much, and please join me in a round of applause for Opie Smith and the men who fought at Chosin Reservoir.
Tom, thank you very much for those stimulating remarks. We have some stimulating questions from the audience first. But as the moderator, I'm going to exert my priority here and just tell you that, you magnificent bastard, I've read your book. And it is a great book, and I commend this to everybody. It is thorough, well-researched, controversial. It'll make some of you mad, it'll make some of you happy, and different chapters make different people happy or sad. The one thing I do want to say about my copy of your book is I took a sharp K-bar and cut out the chapter on Dave Petraeus, because it's out of date. Now that part leads to some of the first questions that are coming to you. With all due respect to Opie Smith, there are a lot of Petraeus and Broadwell, and as you know, Paula Broadwell was here and occupied this very stage earlier this year.
I just want to assure you I've never slept with any generals.
Thanks, Tom. I'm glad to hear that.
Hey, it's don't ask, don't tell.
Yes, it is that time. But here are some of the Petraeus questions. They all run into the same idea, and then we'll get into the AllVolunteer Force and the draft and some other very, very good questions that have come up here. But Petraeus, why do we make heroes and then destroy them? What do you think about the scandal? What is the military policy and regulation on adultery for generals, officers, and enlisted? Does that only apply if it becomes known? Historically, for example, General Eisenhower was known to have had at least one long-term love affair. What does General Petraeus' quote-unquote adultery show about his leadership? Does it matter that he was already retired? Have you read Mrs. Broadwell's biography of General Petraeus? Do you agree with the media's assessment that it reads like a love letter? Not any love letter I've ever read, but. The first role of spycraft is not to get caught. Should Petraeus have resigned for inefficiency rather than bad judgment?
Okay, I think I've got
I
the
think you
gist
got
of
the
question.
drift here.
Let me begin by asking you all a question. Is there anybody here who thinks that Dave Petraeus was the first CIA director to ever have an affair? I just don't get this whole mess. It is a mess. But I come away more worried about our country than I am about Dave Petraeus. Here we have a situation in which the FBI starts prying into basically a lover's quarrel. My tax dollars at work? What is it? The FBI, Office of soap operas? I just don't get how they get involved in this. The second thing is, I covered these wars, spent a lot of time in Iraq, not so much in Afghanistan, but I was there a bit. And I think the real scandal of our generals is how mediocre so many of them were. Tommy Franks, who thought that by invading Iraq and going to Baghdad that he'd won the war, when in fact it was just beginning. Ricardo Sanchez, his successor, had Iraq blow up on his watch and came home cranked off that he didn't get a 4-star for starting an insurgency. And then General Casey, who tried better, but a profoundly conventional man who tried to operate unconventionally and was unable to get the force to do it. Then Dave Petraeus comes along and does a hell of a good job. He does what a general should do at the strategic level. Clausewitz says the first job of the general is to understand the nature of his conflict. Petraeus has a different understanding than his predecessors. He takes some genuine risk. He cuts a deal with the Sunni insurgency. He puts them on the American payroll. 100,000 fighters, $30 million a month. That's what George Steinbrenner used to pay for a Cuban second baseman. I got no problem with that. But this was a risk. It was a risk because he basically had an effective ceasefire with the Sunni insurgency. They did not surrender their weapons. They did not demobilize their forces. They even occupied their areas of operation afterwards. They just agreed to stop killing Americans. Not a bad deal, though. What Petraeus successfully did was extricate us from the war in Iraq, and I believe that was his mission. Yet here we are in an era that I don't understand, in which we care more about the sex lives of our generals than we do the real lives of our soldiers and Marines. The scandal is poor leadership. It's not what people do in their private lives. And I'm even more bothered by the garbage being heaped on John Allen. Newsflash number 1 of the week, Dave Petraeus is a human being. Newsflash number 2, Marine officer flirts with woman. This is a real scandal. So I come away thinking, what is it about our country that leads to such lack of seriousness? The Onion had a good headline, Americans fascinated by general sex scandal, shocked to find war is going on in Afghanistan. Why the national inattention? A lot of people, I really genuinely don't know that we still have people dying in Afghanistan. Why we judge people on their private lives rather than their public performance. We are very harsh about enforcing standards of private life of public officials. And that's not a tradition. People say, oh, we're a puritanical country. But as was pointed out, Eisenhower carried on fairly openly with his beautiful red-haired British chauffeur, Kay Summersby. Yet no one called up Eisenhower in January '44 and said, Ike, you can't lead the D-Day invasion. Now, thousands of boys are going to die because you're not going to be there, but we just can't stand the fact that you're sleeping with your driver. What parent would say, I can't have an immoral general leading my son. Let's get an incompetent new guy in. Likewise, Matthew Ridgeway, who I could talk about at great length too, another general I admired greatly, and by the way, the leading protege of George Marshall and his confidant even as a colonel, Ridgeway, as a colonel in 1939, helps Marshall plan the revamping of the entire U.S. Army, including how to get rid of 600 senior officers they considered deadwood. Ridgeway also had a habit of getting a new wife for each war. Don't try this at home, okay? And he kind of rubbed people's noses in it. His plane that he used to fly around Korea had the name of his new wife, "Hi, Penny," painted on the nose. It was almost like in your face. I married my secretary. What are you going to do about it? And it's fun. I spent years in the military archives, some down at Quantico, mainly at Carlisle and at the National Archives, and also at the George Marshall Library. You go through Ridgway's papers, which are very good and very extensive. He kept great records. So, for example, whenever he disagreed with other generals, he would append all their memos to his memo, and it's in the file. So you can see, like, when the Air Force says, "We can solve Dien Bien Phu, a few nukes, no problem." And Eisenhower and Ridgeway respond, you start dropping a few bombs, and you're into a ground war, and we're not. And Eisenhower said, "I will not waste troops on the periphery of the communist empire. I'm not going to Vietnam," which I think was one of Eisenhower's great decisions. Just to finish the thought, Ridgway's papers have all these cables back and forth about how to get better combat leadership in Korea. He wanted to fire 5 of the 6 division commanders in Korea, and eventually the Army says, "You can do it, but you're going to keep it on the down low. You're going to disguise it because we don't want Congress asking too many questions." Interspersed with Ridgway's papers on combat leadership are some very terse notes from his first wife's divorce lawyer. Are we at a point which we would not allow Eisenhower or Ridgway to command? If so, what does that say about us as a people? That we would let our soldiers and Marines die because we thought somehow that a general lacked sufficient personal standards to represent us in the field. I don't get it. I've never known troops to really care that much about what a general does in his private life. In my experience, troops want 2 things. They want to survive, if possible, and if they have to die, they don't want it wasted by some buffoon. They want the death to mean something. And that's why they want effective combat leadership. To finish the thought, I think we as a society no longer recognize what effective combat leadership looks like.
Great answer, Tom. The next generic group of questions gets even more controversial. Do you think some of our politicians become afraid to fire generals because of Truman's political career ending as a result of his firing MacArthur? Do we hold generals to higher sexual standards than we do our presidents? When reaching the general rank, what percentage of the appointments are based on politics versus skill, experience, and combat accomplishments?
Okay, let me stop there because I've got a lot of thoughts on these to answer these. This gets into some political Washington stuff, which is one reason I spend most of my life outside of Washington now. My wife and I bought a house on an island in Maine and try to be there as much as possible. Political Washington was scared by Colin Powell. And this is not a partisan thing. Both Republicans and Democrats were scared to see a general with such independent political standing. And so in selecting chairman of the Joint Chiefs since then, one of the criteria has been, is this guy going to be a political threat to me? And so there has been a real inclination to pick people who are somehow disqualified and are also pliant, manipulable, or can be intimidated. The second problem is for President Obama. He does not want to be a war president. He was elected on domestic terms. He has an ambitious domestic agenda, and his nightmare is seeing it sidelined and undercut by war. He has referred actually to Vietnam and Lyndon Johnson a few times. Lyndon Johnson has this tremendous domestic agenda that Obama admires and sees it destroyed by a war that kind of creeps up out of nowhere on him, that he doesn't understand what's happening. And so I think when Obama sees the Joint Chiefs walk into his Oval Office, he kind of sees them wearing Westmoreland masks. And this is not a hit on him. He's trying to deal with this, but it's very hard now, I think, for our top military officers to deal with this. How do you talk to a president about military affairs when he doesn't want to hear about military affairs, when that is not his agenda? So it's a difficult situation. Finally, on Truman and MacArthur, no, firing MacArthur did not end Truman's political career. I don't believe he was eligible to run for the presidency again. He'd been president for about 7 years. So he fires MacArthur. MacArthur enjoys a momentary surge in the polls. I actually think MacArthur thought he would be elected president in 1952. He also, by the way, thought he would be elected president in 1944. MacArthur's such a piece of work. He is the only general I know of who was insubordinate to 3 presidents: Hoover, Roosevelt, and Truman. MacArthur goes to the 1952 Republican National Convention in Chicago and delivers the keynote address. And the funny thing was, nobody in America had seen him up close. MacArthur did not come to the United States from before World War II until he was fired in 1951, even when the president asked him to. He said he was kind of busy. MacArthur delivered such a lousy keynote address that his campaign just fizzled right there. And the irony is that instead of MacArthur being nominated, the Republican Party nominated his former aide in the Philippines, whom he had fired. Eisenhower once said, was asked by a woman if he ever was interested in acting in the theater. And he said, no, but I studied drama under MacArthur.
Tom, in your book, you speak very highly of a number of Army 4-star generals, among them Max Thurman, Bill DePue, and some others. In one of my earlier incarnations before I came to work for Mike Myatt, I was an assistant secretary of the Army, and we did the Be All You Can Be campaign that lasted for 21 years and transformed the face of the U.S. Army. And that leads to the other 3 questions on the same subject. Are you in favor of the draft? When should Congress declare war? And what is your take on the all-volunteer force?
First of all, Be All You Can Be was a great motto because it spoke to the ethos of the time, yet conveyed a sense that what the Army could do for you. And it really was enormously effective. You have this great rebuilding of the Army out of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War destroyed the United States Army. It had to be recreated. It had to reconnect itself. They retrained the force, they re-equipped the force, and most importantly, they had to come up with a new way to man the force. The all-volunteer force has been enormously successful. I would argue, and no hit on you, you did a great job in it, I would argue too successful. We are now at the point where we can wage wars and nobody needs to pay attention because the American people no longer have skin in the game. This is a phrase I had to teach my left-wing sister after her son joined the Marines. You got skin in the game, she'd say. And I say, yeah, that's right. Just say it that way. The problem is with the 1% fighting our wars, the 99% not paying attention, American people no longer much care about military affairs, don't pay attention, even when we're waging war, even when we're killing people overseas and losing people. They don't know how to judge generals or military competence. And so everybody thinks they support the troops, but one way to support the troops is by asking generals tough questions. And the Congress doesn't know how to do that anymore. So I would like to see a draft, if only to reconnect people to the military, to have a sense of skin in the game. Now, I don't think you have to have a Vietnam-style draft. I think you could do an alternative, which would be, you sign up for the draft, you get drafted, and you get a great benefits package, free college, and a lot of concessionary loans from the U.S. government, like mortgage loans and so on, rest of your life. Option B, you don't want to be in the military? Not a problem. National service. You bring meals to elderly shut-ins, you clean up the inner city, You work as an assistant to a janitor in a New York City school. And you come out with slightly longer service, slightly less benefits. Some college loans, but not a free ride. But we have a great libertarian tradition in this country. Not a problem. Tell Uncle Sam to take a hike. You just check the libertarian option. Just don't ask Uncle Sam for anything. No college loans, no federal mortgage guarantees, no nothing. You can drive on our roads, you can call the fire department, you can enjoy police protection because you pay taxes. But basically, you're off Uncle Sam's plate. And you decided at age 50 you made a mistake, fine. Come in and drive a general around for a year. I think this is a pipe dream, but I don't have a better way of reconnecting the military to society, and it worries me a lot. I think it's morally reckless to be a great democracy that wages war and does not pay attention to it.
Tom, we're getting close to the final question. In fact, this is the final question. Please contrast Bob Gates and Leon Panetta and Don Rumsfeld, and do you think Panetta is now a good Secretary of Defense for our military as it stands?
I don't know Panetta well. I have not covered him actively, covering the Defense Department. Honestly, people would ask me questions about Panetta, and I'd say, I can talk to you about Terry Allen commanding the 1st Infantry Division in 1943, a lot more than I can talk to you about Panetta. I mean, I was off in the archives. I was thinking about this the other day, though. I covered the Pentagon for a long time, and I was thinking about the background of the 3 best defense secretaries I saw. The 3 best were Dick Cheney, William Perry, and Bob Gates. Now, Dick Cheney begins life as a politician, kind of becomes a federal executive, and then goes into corporate America. So a varied background. Bill Perry is an academic and a venture capitalist. Bob Gates is a career bureaucrat and intelligence officer, intelligence analyst. The commonality I saw was the varied background, and this goes to the Obama administration, not just Panetta, but the narrowness of background of the Obama National Security Team. This is the only time I can remember in American history where the entire National Security Team comes out of the U.S. Congress. President Obama, Vice President Biden, Secretary of State Clinton, Secretary of Defense Panetta are all former members of Congress. And the National Security Advisor and his deputy are both former Hill staffers. Narrowness and background of any sort is not good. It smells to me a little bit of the Kennedy administration, where they were all smart guys from Harvard who were smarter than everybody else. And don't tell them they were wrong about Vietnam, because you must be a coward if you disagree with them. I think this creates a blind spot, a vulnerability in our national security establishment. How it hurts us, I don't know. But when I see people talking about John Kerry as Defense Secretary, I start thinking about moving to Canada.
Tom, last Saturday night at the Marines Memorial right here, we celebrated the 237th Marine Corps birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you, sir. Happy birthday, Marines. For all of you who were there, you received a wonderful bottle of wine that is a commemorative bottle dedicated to our guest of honor that evening, the living American who holds the most cabinet positions, George Pratt Schultz. We provided a wonderful bottle of wine with his official photograph on the bottle. The wine is good, but I really urge you not to drink it and just save the bottle. Tom, thank you for coming today.
Thank you very much. This was great.